Most people, when they think about becoming a better person, they think about it as a matter of deciding to be better. You recognize a flaw in yourself, you resolve to change it, you try harder. And then, usually, you find yourself doing the exact same thing that you were doing before, wondering whatever happened to the resolution. Aristotle's account of how character actually forms is more useful than the resolution model, and it's considerably less flattering. Character, he argues, is not what you intend, nor is it what you actually achieve. It is what you do repeatedly. He said, "We become just by doing just acts. Justice is a habit you get in or you don't." So in this episode, what I want to make this episode about is what that means and what we can do with it once we know about it. Welcome back to American Socrates. I'm Matt Rupert. Aristotle's position in the Nicomachean Ethics is that we become just by doing just acts. We become temperate by doing temperate acts. We become courageous by doing courageous acts. And that sounds a bit circular, and I think it's supposed to be, deliberately. Aristotle is trying to drive home a pretty particular point here, namely that there is no shortcut around doing the part of ethics, like actually acting it out. Character is not formed by our understanding of virtue, like intellectually. Just because you understand that this is the way things are does not mean that you are being ethical. It's not formed by intending to be virtuous either, or even admiring virtues in others, counting your friends among the saints, that sort of thing. Character is formed by acting virtuously, repeatedly, until that action ultimately becomes a stable disposition within ourselves. It is simply who you are now. This is what you do. You could no more do otherwise than you could grow a third arm. The Greek word for habit here is ethos. It's the root of our word for ethics. Aristotle is making an etymological point by invoking this word, at least as much as he is trying to make a philosophical point. Our customs become our character. The two are ultimately the same thing. This is what your personality is. This is the kind of person that people think of when they think of you. And that is ultimately what you act like, especially with respect to those things that you're passionate about or the things that maybe scare you, that sort of thing. Well, things we're cautious of, things that we're adverse to. To say that you're scared of spiders, for example, or maybe to say that you're really into baseball, is to speak about your character. Ethics, in this Aristotelian sense, then, is fundamentally about the formation of a stable character through this habitual action concerning specific matters of right and wrong and happiness and misery. It's not primarily about finding a set of rules to live by, or even a set of principles to follow, or even how to do a specific kind of moral calculation. It's about what kind of person you are becoming through what you repeatedly do. The mechanism then of habit formation is key to understanding what he's trying to say. Repeated action creates the disposition. A disposition is a settled tendency to respond to certain stimuli in a particular way. It's not a matter of conscious choice. It's not made fresh each and every time. It's something closer to like a trained reflex or second nature. This is not an instinct, but it functions like at an almost instinctual level. The courageous person here doesn't deliberate extensively about whether to act courageously in let's say, a potentially dangerous situation. They act courageously because that is what they have become through this form of habituation. The deliberation, if it happened at all, really all happened earlier in the formation of the habit through practice. This is why we practice things, so that in the moment, in the heat of action, This is just how we will act. This is how we will behave. By the time the situation then arrives, the character is already built. It's already there. It's ready to act courageously or not if you didn't do the work. And so people become good by doing good, and they become not good by letting themselves do something less than good. This has a direct implication that you are right now forming your character through what it is that you're repeatedly doing. It's not through what you intend. It's not through what you wish you were doing. It's not through your values as you would, say, articulate them if somebody asked you, well, what do you believe in? What are your values? What do you believe is right? It's through what you actually do. Your actions, your behaviors, day after day, in small decisions that really don't feel like they're character-forming moments to us at all, but they really are. I've often heard parents lament about the reading habits of their kids. Oh, I wish my kids read more. It's a strange complaint to hear escaping the lips of these people because most of them don't read themselves. The value of reading is real, but you can't get it by wishing you read, by intending very sincerely to read, or especially by, say, owning a bunch of books. You're signaling your intent to be a reader because you bought all these books, but you don't ever crack them. You have to do the practice. You have to do the work. You must read. If you do become a reader, you become better informed, better able to concentrate for a longer amount of time on, say, complex issues, better able to articulate your thoughts and ideas in a more coherent manner, and many other skills. You become the kind of person who reads, and it's simply a matter of doing it, of reading, making it a habit. It's like being a swimmer or a craftsman or a good person. They all work exactly the same, according to Aristotle. It's not that intentions aren't important. The intention-based model of character improvement is really and deeply bedded in how most people, I think, especially Americans, think about self-development. I think we should take a second to really examine that and be critical of it. Why does this intention-based model so consistently underdeliver? Intentions tend to operate at the level of conscious thought. They're statements about what you plan to do, made at moments of reflection, when you're not under any kind of pressure, and they typically produce the behavior you're trying to change. For example, a resolution to be more patient is made generally in a calm moment where patience isn't actually required of you. The test comes in a pressured moment, when you're tired, when you're frustrated, when you're behind schedule, someone's doing something annoying to you. In that moment, your noble intention has to compete with a well-practiced habit of impatience. And in these kinds of competitions, habit almost always wins against the intellect, because the habit has been reinforced thousands of times and your intentions are basically brand new babies. I don't mean to give the impression here that this is a weakness of will in the moralistic sense. That is perhaps the everyday interpretation that we tend to assign to ourselves and to others for this sort of moral failing. Rather, I think you should think of this as a straightforward consequence of how behavior is actually structured. Habits are fast, automatic, and they require no deliberate resources. You don't have to think your way through the habit. It just happens automatically. Intentions are slow, they're deliberate, they require great cognitive effort that is depleted very quickly by things like stress and fatigue. When the two compete under pressure, habit almost always wins by default. I mean, think about it. When you're trying to be on a diet or something like that, you're trying to eat differently. The times you break down are, at the end of the day, when you're tired, you're sick of making decisions, you're burnt out with all of the things that you had to do for the day. Your will, your determination, your intentions all fall to the wayside and you resort right back to habit. So the intention here just doesn't have the tools to beat habit. It's a bit too simple to say that a person has failed morally because they fell into their old ways of doing things, their old habits. It's much more realistic to say that they have a habit of moral failings, that either they've never succeeded in changing, or what's probably more realistic, they've never even actually considered trying to change. The practical consequence then is that the point of intervention is not the moment where you have to make a tough decision. It's the pattern of behavior that preceded it over the previous months or years. You do not become patient by deciding to be patient in the moment when you're tested. You become patient by practicing patience, patient responses in much lower stake situations repeatedly, again and again and again, until the disposition is formed around being patient. Then the habit is the thing that activates when you're under pressure, instead of something else like anger or annoyance or whatever. Aristotle would say that the person who relies on good intentions without building good habits has simply confused knowing about virtue with having virtue. The knowledge they have is very real. The virtue, however, isn't really present yet. Virtue lives in the disposition, not in the understanding. Okay, so let's say we understand this now. What exactly are the mechanics of all of this? Well, Aristotle doesn't give us a neurological account of habit formation. I mean, that language just wasn't available to him, right? But the description of the process maps well onto what it is we now understand about behavioral patterns of development and change. Habits form through repetition in context. The same action performed in the same type of situation repeatedly becomes associated with that situation. Eventually, the situation itself triggers the response without requiring any deliberate choice on the part of your consciousness. Your conscious mind becomes free to wander about, and you just react this way on autopilot. Think about driving a car. If you learn to drive a car, at first it was pretty difficult. There was so much to pay attention to. Over time, as many aspects became habit, that is, they became like second nature to you, it got a lot easier. And over years, it's become so well grooved in your mind that you can take an entire trip executing turns, stopping at red lights, avoiding other cars, all while your conscious mind does very little more than jam out to your favorite tunes. But this only really works in the context of driving a certain type of car with a standard set of control mechanisms under a certain set of rules of the road. This is why environment is going to matter to us just as much as our intentions are going to matter. So the context in which you repeat these behaviors is going to shape those behaviors as they get reinforced. As with the car, for example, if you change the model, you change the steering mechanism, you change the transmission mechanism, you change the gear shifting, right? Going from, let's say you only learned on an automatic. The same rules that apply, the same habits you use to drive an automatic will no longer work if you go to a manual transmission. If you go to another country where the rules of the road might be different and operate differently, it's going to be the habits that you formed will no longer be useful. And so you have to learn within a certain context. This is why we become very afraid when people tend to change the rules or change the context on us. Because what used to be streamlined habit-formed behavior now has to be started again as if we had never learned any of it. Another mechanic that we need to look at here is that early formation is disproportionately powerful to later formations. Aristotle emphasizes that habits formed in childhood and early life ultimately establish the baseline from which all later development tends to proceed. This is not determinism. I mean, people can change throughout life, but it is a recognition that early repeated patterns are harder to displace than later ones because they've been reinforced longer and generally more deeply. The person who was raised in an environment that modeled and rewarded patience, for example, has a different starting point than the person who was raised in an environment that modeled and rewarded aggressive self-assertion. Neither of these is fixed, of course, but They are not starting from the same place. A third mechanism we should probably look at is that you can't form a virtue by doing virtuous things just a few times. A single act of respect does not make you a respectful person. It may be the beginning of a pattern, or it may be the exception to a pattern of disrespect. What determines which one it is whether it gets repeated or not. The single act has no lasting effect on character unless it's followed up by more acts of the same kind. This is why Aristotle says we become a thing by doing that action that includes that thing. It's plural, it's ongoing until a disposition is ultimately formed. This is a slow process. One should not set out to change a habit and hope to be complete by the end of the day. Another mechanic that we can look at here is the role of pleasure and pain in habit formation. Aristotle makes a point that modern psychology reaffirms for us. Habits are reinforced by the emotional responses that follow them. Actions that produce satisfaction, pleasure, or relief tend to get repeated. Actions that produce discomfort or pain tend to get avoided. This simple behavioralism means that one of the markers of a well-formed virtue is that exercising it ultimately feels good. I mean, not in a shallow sense, but in the sense of a deep satisfaction. That kind of eudaimonia feeling of being a complete and full person. For example, a person of genuine honesty doesn't struggle through every truthful act. They have a character that they've developed in which acting with honesty is its own reward. They get to feel good about it every time they get to speak the truth or don't have to hide anything. The pleasure has been trained into them right alongside the habit, the disposition. The implication here is that if you want to change a habit, you need to change your emotional responses that ultimately maintain the habits that you have, which requires enough repetition of the new behavior in the relevant context here that the new responses start to feel natural rather than effortful. And we shouldn't forget that one of the most practically important extensions of Aristotle's habit theory is that attention to the role of environment and community is part of character formation. I want to connect then what we're doing in this episode with habit back to what I did in a previous episode where I covered the relationship between ethics and politics. You're not going to form these habits in a vacuum. You form them within specific environments, inside your family, inside your workplace, inside your community, inside your friendships. And that makes certain behaviors easy and others difficult. These environments then are going to model certain responses and treat others as aberrant. They're going to reward certain dispositions and they're going to penalize others. The old saying that, if you lay down with dogs, you rise up with fleas. It's that sort of idea, the people that you associate with do have an impact on your character, on the kinds of habits that you form. The environment is doing constant, low-level character formation, whether you're attending to it or not. I mean, think of how hard it might be to quit smoking after years of puffing a pack a day. But now think about how much harder it would be when everyone around you, your friends, your family, your coworkers, all smoke regularly and encourage you to join them. The family. The family is the first and probably most powerful environment for habit formation. The patterns that are modeled by our parents and other caregivers, like how to handle conflict, how to express certain emotions, how resources should be shared among family members, how failure gets treated. Those become absorbed by children before those children have the reflective capacity to evaluate whether those are good models or not. These early patterns then are not destiny, but they are the starting point from which we're going to judge all later developments. Understanding your own early formation then is a part of the self-knowledge that practical wisdom or ethics is going to require of you. Adults spend more waking hours in their workplace than almost anywhere else. And so the norms of that environment, the workplace, how we treat each other, how success gets defined, what behaviors are rewarded and what are simply overlooked or taken for granted. Those are also doing continuous character work on who you are. A workplace that rewards cutthroat competition and punishes vulnerability mercilessly is forming the character of everyone in that workplace, regardless of whatever they believe their private values to be. A workplace that models honest communication and genuine accountability does the same in a different direction. People tend to underestimate this because they think of work as something they do rather than something that shapes who they are. But if Aristotle's right, this is very key to who you are. Aristotle is direct about the importance of who you spend time with, friends, chosen family, loved ones of every sort. The people around you all model a certain behavior. They set norms. They provide or withhold the social reinforcement that ultimately maintains your habits. Sustained associations then with people whose habits are better than yours tends to pull your habits upwards. Like once a certain critical mass of these people is achieved, you hang out with them enough time, you spend enough time with them. The reverse, of course, is equally true and considerably more common. This is not a moralistic point about avoiding bad influences. I'm trying to say that there's a structure out there. This is a structural point about how habit formation works. And if you're aware of it, you can sort of take control of it. The question really you should be asking is whether you are attending to what you're doing or not. Okay, so let's say you don't really like this. What can we do about something in your character, something you don't like about yourself? Well, if character is formed by repeated action rather than intentions, then changing character simply requires changing the repeated actions. Not necessarily changing your mind about what you value, but changing what you actually do in certain contexts where the habit operates. Again, the easy example is quitting smoking. You might intend to quit smoking, as Mark Twain said, "Quitting smoking is the easiest thing in the world. I must have done it 1,000 times." But you don't actually quit until you change the behavior, and that usually means changing the environment, noting what happens under certain places where you're impelled to smoke, and simply acting differently or putting a replacement habit in there, like chewing gum instead of having a cigarette. The point here is that you do have to know, you do have to have a goal. You have to have some sort of intention in order to change these habits. But knowing it is only half the battle. So knowing's important, it's just not enough. It's not virtue itself. In the same way that a signpost might point you down the right road, but it's not enough to actually get you to your destination. So we can gain some practical advice from these implications that fall out of Aristotle's habit theory here. First, start smaller than feels meaningful to you. The intention-based model typically involves ambitious resolutions. Something like be more patient, be a much more disciplined person, read more books, lose 50 pounds, be more honest with people, put yourself out there. These are just too large and probably too abstract to be the target of some sort of habit formation. The Aristotelian approach targets specific behaviors in specific contexts. Don't say, be more patient. Say, when my child interrupts me, pause before responding. Don't say, be more disciplined. Say, do this specific thing at this specific time before allowing yourself any kind of specific reward. Don't say to yourself, read more books. Say, read 3 pages every day. The smaller and more specific the target behavior, the more traction for habit formation it has. And you simply build up on this over time. A second implication that I think falls out of this is that repetition in context matters a lot more than the intensity of the repetition. A dramatic effort made once has much less character-forming effect than a mild and modest effort made consistently. This kind of runs against the intuition that more effort would equal more change. Aristotle's framework suggests exactly the opposite, that consistent small repetitions in relevant context are going to outperform the occasional, very intense effort. The habit forms through the repetition and not through the intensity. And so cleaning your house a little every day is going to be far more effective for keeping your house clean than big, catastrophic room cleanings 1 to 5 times a month. The small daily improvement then is the best course for this kind of long-term growth. Third, expect the early stages to feel pretty unnatural. Aristotle acknowledges that acting virtuously before the virtue is fully formed is going to require a lot of sustained effort and feels very effortful. The courageous act feels harder for the person still forming the habit of courage than for the person who it already has become a stable disposition. This isn't evidence that character change isn't happening, although I think all too many of us would fear that it wasn't. The truth is that the normal texture of early habit formation, the effortfulness, is going to decrease slowly over time as the disposition develops. If it never does decrease, then habit formation hasn't completed, and you're probably doing it too infrequently. Finally, the goal here is a self that acts well without having to try very hard. This is the end point that Aristotle's been pointing us towards. Not a person who heroically overcomes their nature every day through sheer saintly willpower, but a person whose nature has been shaped through practice so that acting well is what comes naturally to them. That person isn't coasting somehow. They did the work. They just did it earlier in the formation of their habits through practice. The ease of virtue in the well-formed person is simply the dividend of all of that early effort. It's the payout. It's not evidence that no effort was required or that this person is just naturally morally better. I should really note here, too, that we all too often ascribe the dividends like a work ethic or something like that, their virtue to maybe their status or their race or their class or their gender. I mean, even Aristotle was painfully guilty of this kind of false attribution. But it's not these identities. It's the hard labor of self-improvement that makes one a good person, or the lack of that kind of labor that makes one a bad person. Okay, to sum up then, Aristotle's claim that we become what we repeatedly do is not really comfortable to us. It means that the person you are right now is substantially the product of what you've been repeatedly doing. Not what you've been intending, not what your values are in the abstract, not what you think of yourself as being, but what you have been doing. It is also one of the most genuinely hopeful things in all of ethics, because it puts the ball firmly in your hands. Your character is not fixed. It's not fixed by nature. The habits you have formed can be reshaped. They can be reformed. The dispositions you have are not your destiny, but they can only be changed by acting, by doing, by choosing different actions in specific contexts repeatedly until the new pattern displaces the old one. The intention to change is simply the beginning. It is not the change itself. So the question I want to leave you with is, what are you actually practicing? Not what do you intend, not what you wish you had practiced more 20 years ago, but what you are doing repeatedly in all the areas of your life that matter most right now. Whatever that answer is, that's the person that you are trying to become. Thanks for tuning in to American Socrates. If today's episode of Philosophy got you thinking in new ways, make sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. New, full episodes drop every Wednesday. If you enjoyed the show, leave a review. It helps others find us, and it means a lot. And if you know someone who could use a little more practical wisdom in their life, share this episode with them. Until next time, keep questioning everything.